configuration management, vulnerability scanning. You need to be able to not reinvent the wheel, but use what's there. You need to be able then to detect as it's happening, as it's occurring. You can't wait to read about it later. You can't wait for a log report that, oh, I've got a problem. You need to find it within seconds of its initiation. And then you need to be able to, in a post-perimeter, post-boundary environment, you also be able, it's required that you be able to quantitatively predict, predictive threat simulation, analysis on your environment to determine where your exposures are quantitatively before you're actually exploited. Because the most secure network possible is the one that's never hit with the exploit in the first place. And unless you can do predictive, you can't get to that point. So those would be the three areas: being able to federate, being able to detect dynamically, and then be able to actually do predictive threat simulations, validations quantitatively in advance in a post-boundary environment.
Thank you. These
Did that make it clearer what the question was about?
I'm just thinking about 80s night. No,
Okay.
that made it clear for me. Thank you. The next two questions actually came from some emails I'd sent out. This one I want to address to Chris. And the question was read as, much security focus is always placed at the gateway, the hard country outside but soft inside. And the question posed was, how do you take a different approach or cost-effectively incorporate a similar approach internally as we focus more on consolidated data centers, clouds, and private clouds?
So it's interesting. That question kind of tacks on to the back of the last question, which is essentially the idea of deperimeterization is obviously a key piece of this. And I think a lot's been made of deperimeterization. The funny thing is, I mean, there's obviously three things going on. One is we're consuming a lot more internet applications. Two is we're a lot more flexible in terms of rolling applications into either straight up outsourcers or cloud-based solutions. But it's essentially that idea of flexing applications out into public infrastructure. And third is, there's the idea of user access from anywhere, to the mobility point that Paul made earlier. So these are all things to say, oh, you know what, the perimeter's getting too hard to manage. Let's just chuck it. We're gonna deperimeterize. And the interesting thing is that if you look at a lot of these drivers, they suggest that the perimeter needs to change from that sort of hard, crunchy outside to and the soft, chewy inside to something that's got even more structure. And so it's interesting. Forrester Research has done some interesting stuff around this idea of zero trust. And there's zero trust architecture that suggests taking perimeter-style defenses and weaving them throughout the different trust zones in the organization, and essentially creating a honeycomb-like framework in an organization, getting you two things. I mean, obviously, the additional segmentation, provided it's meaningful and not port-based, gets you additional security. The other thing that gets you is the idea that you can carve off some of these honeycombs and dump them out into the cloud in a very quick fashion. So if there's something you want to either burst out to the cloud or roll out to the cloud quickly, these things, this modularity of the infrastructure makes it much easier. The third thing it gives you is this idea of a logical perimeter. And this is the part that I think some of the folks up on this panel are very interested in, this idea that no matter where my user is, I can subject him or her to the same policies as if they were physically resident in the organization. So this idea of a logical perimeter despite the absence of any sort of coherent physical perimeter, if that makes sense.
Sure, Paul.
Yeah, if I can just touch on the idea of perimeters, I think it's really kind of an interesting one. When we start to think about mobility and where your data is and what it's being stored on, it's really overwhelming to kind of try and get your arms around that. I mean, cloud computing, other trends that are occurring right now. So I like this notion of sort of quantitative threat prediction. I think that's kind of an interesting concept. And then also this real time, as the network is demonstrating what's occurring on it back to people and reporting it back, the idea of identifying in seconds. I like all of what those concepts are. And I think that's some of what we're trying to apply into the mobile networks that are inside government facilities.
Thanks. Mike, this last question is for you. Question was asked, what benefits you see in bundling firewall, intrusion detection, and data leakage protection?
Well, I would say that as some of my fellow panelists pointed out, Port 80 is open, and the first generation stuff isn't very effective at stopping stuff inbound or probably outbound. So there's those additional tools that have become available recently. We've invested a lot in allowing our customers to not just have a firewall in the network, but to also give it other treatment, AV scanning, do web and URL filtering, data leakage, look for strings, look for social security numbers, those type of things, so that you're getting a lot more of that layer 7 type of intelligence and applying your policy as packets are flowing inbound or outbound.
Awesome.
If I could add one other thing, we've talked about how to identify the threat. I think another concept that's important to bring into the discussion, we're referring to mobile users, we're referring to people running advanced exploits and hiding in traffic that looks normal to systems that are already deployed. We're talking about some of the A/B scans, web filters, whatever. There's another thing that's important in the environment, and that's the behavior of your users. Not only your users, but actually the behavior of your architecture. Every application has a behavioral profile. Every network device has a behavioral profile. Every user has a behavioral profile. And we worry a lot about zero-day events. We worry about insider threats. We worry about things that we don't know about yet. One of the things that's interesting is any exploit's going to change behavior somewhere in your architecture. If you're monitoring that on a second-to-second basis, that change in behavior, be they mobile, be they in your data center, be they a web application of some sort, be they in the cloud, in somebody else's data center or a virtualized server, when the behavior changes, if you can detect it, you can respond to it. And so advanced threat detection response capability should always have this concept of behavior.
Great, thank you guys. We're going to move on now to another topic, basically the topic of mobility. Obviously it's come up a lot. We've talked about it a lot today, and I think there's a consensus that this is definitely where things are going, not just given current trends, but obviously as the younger workforce moves up, everyone expects to telework and to use their PDAs and to have it all integrate together. So I think this is a very important topic, and it needs to be focused on. Paul, given the background you have, I'll start with you. How do you think the government needs to address security around the increased use of mobile devices?
Okay, so I'm going to lighten things up a little bit here. It's 80s night, right? So I sent this email around my office, and I said, look, we got to get dressed up for 80s night. Does anybody have, a mobile device from the 80s? You know what I'm saying?
Does it have a web browser?
So I find that this is a very effective tool at deterrence when you're whacking somebody over the head with it. Behavioral modification might be a good use for this phone. It's heavy. You know what I'm saying? It's 3 watts. It's a serious phone and transmits, I think, about a mile. So it's kind of got some interesting features. The battery's dead. So, yeah, that's the leather belt clip. Somebody's got one. But I thought it was interesting that it was still in our office, So anyway, really the government, I think, faced a similar challenge in the 80s when the divestiture of AT&T originally occurred, right? And it's 1984, and we're all saying, okay, now, Mr. Building Owner, you now own